Hi. You may notice that I'm in a different place than usual. I feel a little weird because for the first time I'm doing this with people nearby. My friends who also live in this apartment are in the next room. So I'm like, have an audience other than my cats. But yeah, anyway, I'm in a different apartment now because I'm quarantining with friends. So because I like covering basics and answering questions that you might be too afraid to ask, I want to talk about just some of the basics of what exactly is an IPA. If you have been around beer in the last 20 years, it's probably 3 letters you've heard thrown around a lot. In the last couple decades, IPAs have kind of been praised as the holy grail of American beer, for good reason and also for bad reason, and we'll get into that. So I kind of just want to clarify what exactly an IPA is and what differentiates it between other styles of beer, and we can go through this sort of word by word. So a pale ale, by definition, is just any ale, which is a beer brewed in the ale style as opposed to the lager style, which means at higher temperatures than lagers, usually for less time and top fermented. So it's an ale made with paler colored malt, and that's the grain used in it, which is usually barley. What differentiates an India Pale Ale from the broader category of pale ale is that India Pale Ales generally just have a lot of hops in them. Why is it called an India Pale Ale? So the style came about in England in the early to mid 1800s. It was discovered that throwing a bunch of hops into beer worked as a preservation method, so IPAs were really great for sustaining throughout the long ship journey from England to India, and it also did well on the Indian market. IPAs by definition have between 4.5 to 17.2% alcohol by volume. Obviously that's a huge range. And in terms of bitterness, they have a reputation for being bitter, which they often are because there are so many hops included, but not always. The bitterness can range from 25 to 120 IBUs, that's International Bittering Units. So basically IPA is actually a pretty broad category of beer that's just pale ale with a bunch of hops in it, and there are a bunch of different variations under that broad category. IPAs are actually the most popular style of craft beer in America as of 2019. Sorry, my cat's being an asshole. There's a fly. So that's basically it. When you hear people talk about liking IPAs or hating IPAs, they're actually referring to beers that can taste a lot of different ways. There are subcategories under IPA that you've probably seen around quite a bit, such as West Coast IPA and New England IPA. It's common for West Coast IPAs to be clarified, whereas New England IPAs are usually hazy, which just means that they haven't had that sediment filtered out. New England IPAs also tend to be made with hops that have citrusy flavors to them, so you'll see a lot of New England IPAs being described as juicy, and that's because they are. You'll taste them and it'll kind of taste like drinking beerish orange juice. You've probably also heard terms like double and triple and imperial IPA, and those basically just mean turning up the volume on all of those things, flavors and ABV, the alcohol content. It's good to know what those terms mean, but they're basically much looser definitions than you might think. It doesn't necessarily mean that the amount of hops or malt or the ABV or anything about the beer has literally been doubled or tripled. It just means it's been turned up to a certain degree. Those are words that brewers tend to use as more descriptive labels than definitive definitions. That's what definitions are. They're more descriptions than they are definitions. One thing that I want to make really clear is that, and I feel like this needs to come with the IPA video, is that people who like IPAs or hate IPAs, it doesn't necessarily have any bearing on your taste, whether you have good taste or bad taste, like or hate IPAs. It doesn't really correlate. The reason that IPAs are popular with craft beer drinkers is that they tend to be very flavorful because they have a lot of hops, which are a very flavor imparting ingredient. So there's a lot to comment on. You usually get a really strong aroma from them and strong flavors because there's a lot of hops in them. So that they'll be super piney or citrusy or whatever flavors the hops might be imparting. And if you like a flavorful drink, which if you're a beverage person, you probably do, it's obvious why you like IPAs. That said, it makes sense that a lot of IPAs can be just way too aggressive for someone who's not super into or exposed to a lot of beer, or even someone who is. A lot of it, even for me, if I wanted that much alcohol, I don't want that much alcohol. It can just be a little bit much, but to each their own. Actually, what a brewer once said to me is that when it comes to lagers and other beers that have more subtle flavors, it actually takes a more refined palate to be able to parse out what those different flavor notes are. So preferring Pilsners to IPAs doesn't necessarily mean that you're basic. If anything, it might mean that you're more able to parse out flavor differences that are much more nuanced and subtle than IPAs, which are super in your face. It would make sense that you might need to have a little bit more experience with beer and be exposed to it before you might be into something like an IPA that's really in your face and aggressive in flavor. For some people, it's an acquired taste because one of the flavors that hops impart is bitterness. A lot of IPAs are bitter because they have a lot of hops in them, but not all. Some IPAs, especially New England IPAs, tend to be more mild in the bitterness department because the hops that are chosen have more of the other flavor qualities like citrusiness or whatever than the bitterness. So drinking IPAs, you'll probably find bitterness, sometimes more than others. What IPAs should you try? This is the fun part. I feel like I'm always on the hunt for a really good New England IPA because I like that juicy, hazy flavor. There's just a lot to savor in there. So if you have favorite IPA, specifically New England IPA recommendations, let me know. But as far as things that you could try if you want to kind of get into IPAs, here in Southern California, Modern Times has a bunch of IPAs that are all super good. They tend to be well-rounded. As far as stuff that you can find everywhere, Bell's Two Hearted and Goose Island IPA are two really solid, consistently award-winning beers that are available in most markets. But of course, it's always fun to see what your local breweries are doing, so I encourage that as much as possible. So whether you are new to the beer world or not, I hope you have or can develop an appreciation for IPAs. But if not, that's okay too, because there are a lot of different styles out there and ways that beer can taste, and none of them are necessarily better than others. Liking IPAs doesn't necessarily mean you have really good taste, and hating IPAs doesn't necessarily mean you have really bad taste. It's a matter of opinion. That's your IPA 101. Hopefully next time someone is drinking or talking about IPAs near you, you feel equipped to participate in the conversation. And if someone says that they like IPAs or hate IPAs, ask them what kind specifically. Let me know if you have favorites that you feel very strongly about. I always want to hear about everyone's favorite beers. Let me know what you're drinking in quarantine, and let me know if there's anything else you want a 101 basics lesson on when it comes to beer or beverages or anything else for that matter. Okay, see ya.